Hi, everyone. I'm Bennett. I'm a PhD student at the University of Utah in philosophy. The title of my talk is A Dilemma for Hermeneutical Pluralism in Psychiatry. And if you want to follow along with the slides at your own pace, I've temporarily posted them to my website, which is here, Bennett, two N's, two T's, Knox, KNOX.com/scientist. So, to go that way. So this project is part of me basically laying the groundwork for my dissertation, which is going to be about pluralism in psychiatry. So it's pretty preliminary at this point, and I've already got a lot of great ideas from the previous talks today about where to go with this in the future. And I'm open to more suggestions in the Q&A. All right, let me get into it. So, quick overview of where I'm going to go in the presentation. I'm going to start off talking about Sandra Mitchell's integrative pluralism view in science in general. I'm then going to talk about Ken Pendler's explanatory pluralism view, which references Mitchell's view for psychiatry in particular. I'm going to move from talking about explanatory pluralism to what I'm going to call hermeneutical pluralism. And then I'm going to present what I think is a dilemma for hermeneutical pluralism, namely the tension between isolation versus assimilation. Everyone seeing my slides and everything? Okay, it's like progressing and whatnot. Okay, just a second. I'm not used to doing the meetings. All right, and then finally, I'm going to leave off with some possible solutions to this dilemma. So first of all, though, what is pluralism in science and psychiatry? So this word pluralism, it's been growing in popularity in the past few decades, both in philosophy of science in general, as well as in philosophy of psychiatry in particular. Yet it's not always clear exactly what we mean when we say pluralism, and different people tend to use this term in a plurality of different ways. So rather than trying to sort of canvas every single use of the word pluralism in the literature, I'm going to sort of give you my working definition for the kind of pluralism that I'm talking about in this presentation. So when I'm talking about pluralism, what I mean is for some domain of inquiry, there are multiple ways of understanding this domain, and we can't reduce these ways of understanding to a single way of understanding, like put in the most broad terms that I can think of. And there are many sort of different varieties that would all fit this definition. So we might have methodological pluralism, where we have multiple methods for understanding some domain of interest. Explanatory pluralism, where we have multiple explanations. Representational pluralism, or hermeneutical pluralism, where we have sort of different understandings, different interpretations of a domain of interest. And there are also sort of two distinct claims that I think we might be making when we're talking about pluralism. There's sort of a descriptive claim, like, okay, actually, in fact, there do exist multiple ways of understanding some domain. But there's a stronger claim that one could make, a normative or a prescriptive claim, that actually pluralism in this whatever domain we're talking about is desirable. It's something that we should want. It's, people often use the phrase healthy pluralism. So now I'm going to move into talking about Mitchell's view, integrative pluralism. So Sandra Mitchell, I'm sort of giving you just the broad strokes here, but her view argues that in sciences that deal with objects that have certain kinds of complexity, we're not going to be able to reduce scientific explanations down to one theory that one simple type of explanation at a single level of analysis. She argues for this view that she calls integrative pluralism. And one of her central examples to illustrate this view in this book, On Simple Truth, is the scientific study of depression. So obviously she thinks that the psychiatric domain is one of these scientific domains where we're not going to get just one simple explanation at a single level of analysis. Now, her integrative pluralist view envisions science investigating complex domains, the domains with complex objects, at different levels of analysis all at once. And these sort of different explanations at different levels of analysis can't just be reduced down to one unified theory of the domain we're talking about. At least we can't reduce them down without critical loss of information. And yet, on this view, different levels of analysis are still in dialogue with one another. We're still, the findings that we have at sort of one level of analysis, or in terms of like one kind of explanation, they're going to be relevant to other explanations, other levels of analysis. That's sort of the integrative part of the view. And so Kenneth Kendler, in this 2005 paper, explicitly adopts Mitchell's integrative pluralism as a model for explanatory pluralism in psychiatry. And he says that psychiatry should be aiming for what he calls patchy reductionism and piecemeal integration between these different levels of explanation in psychiatry. So, you know, the biological, the psychological, the social, etc. And this is sort of like an approach that is, I think, my sense is that it's growing in popularity. Many people would adopt some sort of explanatory pluralist approach in psychiatry. And to me, it does seem much more promising than sort of like strict reductionist that try to just like reduce psychiatry down to, for instance, just the neurobiological. But I think that there's a problem for the integrative pluralist view, and mainly because I'm not sure that this type of integrative pluralism that Mitchell and Kendler are advocating for really represents a thoroughgoing type of pluralism. So what I mean here is we might worry that this type of pluralism is just kind of temporary. Like maybe we just lack information because our understanding of, for instance, the psychiatric domain is not that great. And so as a matter of fact, we have to kind of take a pluralist approach for now because we just don't have the information about how the different levels of analysis fit together. But we still might be aiming at sort of one unified theory and aiming to integrate all of these things together into one way of understanding, which would not be sort of thoroughgoingly pluralist on the view that I'm pushing. On the other hand, though, if the view is thoroughgoingly pluralist, then we have sort of a different danger that we might end up just being sort of isolationist in the sense that, well, if we have these understandings at different levels of analysis and they can't be fully integrated with one another, then sort of what's the impetus for us to try to achieve sort of patchy reduction or piecemeal integration between these different levels of analysis? I don't think that this is sort of a devastating objection to integrative pluralism, but I want more. I want a fuller account of like how this thoroughgoing pluralism, but also with integration is supposed to work. And this sort of problem is going to be echoed in the dilemma I'm going to present for what I'm going to call hermeneutical pluralism. So it seems to me that some form of explanatory pluralism is right for psychiatry, or at least it's sort of the best view on offer that I've found. Okay? But I don't think that we should try to reduce psychiatry to only scientific understanding. So, we've heard about in some of the other presentations so far today, these sort of, patient service user survivor-driven movements like the neurodiversity movement, Mad Pride, survivor activism, that generate these understandings which, at least sort of on the face of them, can often seem to be radically opposed to scientific psychiatry. Now, no, I'm not trying to say that, the understandings that come out of these movements are necessarily anti-scientific. We just had a whole presentation from Sarah and Marie about how that's not the case. But what I'm trying to say here is that there might still be value in maintaining aspects of these understandings which are external to science, which are extra scientific. Okay, so to sort of like try to make the contrast between these two types of pluralism more clear, explanatory pluralism is concerned with sort of explanations internal to science. And it states that in psychiatry, there are going to be these multiple irreducible scientific explanations. What I'm calling hermeneutical pluralism sort of extends the pluralism out beyond just science and says there are going to be multiple ways of understanding the domain that psychiatry deals with, and some of these are going to be extra scientific. And I'm making sort of the stronger normative version of the claim here. I'm saying this type of hermeneutical pluralism, it's a thing we should be aiming for. It's a good thing. It's a desirable state of affairs. We shouldn't be trying to just reduce all understandings of the domain of psychiatry to scientific ones. We should be trying to cultivate this sort of like healthy pluralism. And this leads me to the dilemma for how we actually go about doing this. So this sort of it's parallel, I think, to the problem that I presented for the integrated pluralist view. So the first horn of the dilemma is isolation. So, if we go with this horn, this would be sort of maybe scientific understandings and extra scientific understandings are in some sense incompatible with one another. And if that's true, then it seems like psychiatry just doesn't have an impetus to really substantively grapple with these types of criticisms since they're just incompatible with it. On the other hand, the second horn is assimilation. And the danger here is, well, if we think scientific psychiatric understandings and extra scientific ones, if they can be integrated, then we might worry that psychiatry is just going to end up sort of assimilating these extra scientific understandings to serve its own ends. So let me get into the horns in a little bit more detail. So the first horn is isolation horn. So I'm gonna use the neurodiversity movement, neurodiversity paradigm as an example here. I think that sort of you can make an analogous case for something like mad pride and other sorts of understandings, but I'm just going to use neurodiversity as my example. So at least some, both within the neurodiversity movement and within psychiatry, some at least see the neurodiversity paradigm as radically opposed to what's sometimes called the pathology paradigm, which at least historically has been sort of foundational to scientific psychiatry. And if these sorts of understandings are really incompatible, well, on the one hand, we can avoid sort of problematic reductionism, which is a good thing. But there's a danger, because if psychiatry sees the sorts of understandings of the neurodiversity paradigm as just like radically opposed to psychiatric science, then this kind of gives psychiatry an excuse to not really engage substantively with the criticisms that come out of the neurodiversity movement. And this would prevent psychiatric science from being able to learn from these types of things. And there's an added danger that if we go with the isolation horn, that this might contribute to some forms of epistemic injustice, and specifically hermeneutical injustice. In fact, that's why I picked the word hermeneutical to refer to this view. And the danger here is that psychiatry might just dismiss the understandings of the neurodiversity movement out of hand because it sees them as just like radically incompatible or opposed to psychiatry. And given that at least I'm talking mostly about the U.S. context here, but given that psychiatry has just much more power and resources and money than the neurodiversity movement, we might worry that if we go with this horn, that psychiatry is just going to kind of steamroller over the neurodiversity movement. Now, if we go with the second horn, we run into some other issues. I mean, we do avoid a lot of the problems associated with the isolation horn, which is good. It would allow psychiatry to really learn from the critiques that come out of the neurodiversity movement, and especially sort of scientific criticisms of psychiatry that come out of the neurodiversity movement. That seems good, but there's also a danger. On this horn, the danger is that scientific psychiatry will try to sort of reduce down neurodiversity understandings and sort of twist them to fit its own goals. And that this will result in sort of the loss of the value of the really radical criticisms of psychiatry that come out of the neurodiversity movement. So, an example here, and I think that this, like, to some extent is already happening. We might worry that, like, autism research organizations can sort of pick up at least the language of neurodiversity without actually really, making any sort of deep changes to their practices. So they might sort of pay lip service to neurodiversity rhetoric and still, fund research into, like, cures for autism, which most people in the neurodiversity movement would say are, like, is quite objectionable. So the danger with the second harm basically is that psychiatric science might just assimilate the parts of the neurodiversity paradigm that it finds useful and sort of in the process rob it of really the valuable medical nature of its criticism. Okay, now I've sort of presented this dilemma, but I don't really think that it's like a true dilemma in the sense that I don't think we're doomed to just like embrace one horn or the other. I think actually we definitely can find a way to sort of steer between the dangers of isolation versus assimilation, and that like we have to. But I think, for the purposes of this conference, what's the reason that I'm giving this presentation at this conference is that I think we have to sort of keep the dangers of both isolation and assimilation in view as we're trying to work on incorporating these sorts of, patient, service user, survivor perspectives into psychiatric research, and especially the ones that are at least seen as more radical. Okay, I guess I'm almost at time. I'm not sure. I just will gesture slightly at some sort of possible solutions or future directions that I might want to take this research. So one sort of view, I'm going to butcher this person's name, Jeroen van Bovel, who advocates for what he calls interactive pluralism, which is sort of directly a response to Mitchell's integrative pluralism. And the idea here is that rather than always trying to push for sort of integration, even piecemeal integration, on this view, we sort of recognize that actually sometimes having different understandings be isolated from one another can actually be valuable. And it seems like this might be a case where that's true. Another, place where I'm thinking of looking is in Feyerabend's like anarchic pluralism, where he like really explicitly advocates for cultivating extra scientific understandings as, really valuable. And finally, I need to do a deep dive into the literature on survivor research, because this is an area where it seems like, people are already dealing with these problems and like figuring out how to sort of navigate this dilemma in practice. All right, that's what I got.